Well, the Epstein files have finally begun to be released, and they show that Jeffrey Epstein himself said that notorious photograph of Prince Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre's bare midriff when she was just 17 years old, that he spent so long trying to deny, trying to pour cold water on, trying to discredit, is genuine. Yes, that is one of the many bombshells from this new trove of 20,000 documents, emails, photographs, other artifacts released by the Jeffrey Epstein estate to the House Oversight Committee. And these new documents have been released by the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. I know some of you might be wondering, why are we only seeing these documents? What's going on? Why are these documents being released when there's still pressure to release so much more? I'm not actually a massive document paperwork guy, but I've been speaking to some of my colleagues at the Daily Beast, and they tell me that the 20,000 bits of data that are now in the possession of the House Oversight Committee are from the Epstein estate, which has agreed to release these files to the House, to the House of Representatives, to the Oversight Committee, and that there is another 300,000, so 15 times this amount of paperwork, that is the full Epstein investigation files that there is now pressure to release, and of course that haven't been released, and that people are suspicious that Trump may have political motives to not be releasing them. So that's just the context of what's going on. But I think that for those of us who are interested in the royal story, the most interesting element will be the conversations between Epstein and Andrew, and another affiliated conversation between Epstein and Peter Mandelson, who was briefly the British ambassador to the United States, a sort of incredibly well-connected British politician who's been at the heart of power for several decades, a key part of the Tony Blair team that seized power in 1997 in a sort of unprecedented overturn of the Conservative rule, and a very integral guy who seems to have been a great friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who there is a photograph that has done the rounds of Epstein in a sort of bathrobe, lounging, grinning like the cat that got the cream at one of Epstein's palatial homes. Let's just go through them in order. Let's start with the big bombshell. Epstein saying that the photograph was real. Now, I think it's extraordinary. This is a huge development. It completely blows apart Andrew's whole, what was left of Andrew. I mean, let's face it, people stopped believing Andrew a long time ago. Although, interestingly, I was talking to one of his friends today who is still insisting that the photograph is fake and that Epstein is a Mossad agent, can't be believed, and this kind of stuff. Well, I don't know. Make your own minds up, because we're hopefully, if my producer Ben is back with me today, we're going to be able to show you some of these clips and some of these excerpts from the files themselves. So here we see Epstein and Andrew sort of desperately scrabbling to save his own skin as the first reports of the involvement with Giuffre and the publication of the photograph begin to leak out. So, and we see Andrew just basically saying, you know, I want to save my own skin. Keep me away. Keep my name out of it. Make it clear that I have nothing to do with it. And then we're going to talk about that a little more in a moment. So there were two specific emails in that chain that I discussed in detail with Nico Hines, the global editorial director of the Daily Beast, who was in Washington, D.C. yesterday evening in a live, which you can see on YouTube and on my Substack. And in the first of those emails that we talked about on the 4th of March 2011, this is after the photograph has been published in the Mail. And now the Mail are working on a bigger story detailing all of the allegations made by Giuffre in her book. Many of them are repeated in this version of the article that is sent to them for comment. Andrew responds, "What? I don't know any of this. How are you responding?" Epstein replies, "Just got it 2 minutes ago. I've asked lawyers to send a letter. Not sure. It's so salacious and ridiculous. I'm not sure how to respond. The only person she didn't have sex with was Elvis." Andrew, using the email alias The Duke, then replies to Epstein saying, "Please make sure that every statement or legal letter states clearly that I am not involved and that I knew and know nothing about any of these allegations. I can't take any more of this. My end." And there, I think you have the quintessence of Andrew, the bleating mummy's boy, desperate to save his own skin, thinking only of himself, absolutely no concern or consideration for anything other than, you know, the sort of imperiousness of sort of ordering them to keep his name out of it. Well, how can they keep his name out of it? It's a story by a newspaper, by a credible journalist with documentary evidence. So, but it's typical of Andrew that, well, it's nothing to do with me. And that's what I've always been told by his friends, has been Andrew's response to this all the way through, has just been like, it's nothing to do with me. I don't know what you're talking about. Just this sort of absolute blank denial. 2 days later, on March the 6th, 2011, Epstein sends Andrew an email, which I think looks like it is intended for public consumption. So I think we need to be careful how we read this, because the subject line is, "Feel free to pass this to your press people." And the message reads, "You okay? These stories are complete and utter fantasy. I don't know and have never met Al Gore. Clinton was never on the island. The telephone book is not mine. It was stolen by my houseman that is currently in prison for doing so." So why I'm mentioning this is because what Epstein seems to be doing is to sort of be creating a false paper trail, effectively, that casts him in a better light. So it's like, you can share this email with your press, don't share the other one where we talk about wanting to play some more and that kind of stuff. But, this one's fine. It is absolutely fascinating to work your way through these, especially when you consider the time and the context of exactly what's happening. As I say, I am not by nature a huge kind of document person, but even for me, it's absolutely fascinating to read. The other exchange that I think is really interesting, which shows Epstein trying to game the response, and I think is very dangerous for Buckingham Palace, is an email that he sends to his publicist, Peggy Siegel. And he messages, Peggy Siegel was a kind of well-known New York City publicist funny enough, when I was living in New York. And Epstein emails her, urging her to get Giuffre discredited in the Huffington Post. And the really extraordinary line in this is that he says that if they can discredit her, Buckingham Palace would love it. That is a really, really dangerous line, because we actually know that Buckingham Palace would have loved it, and that Buckingham Palace did everything they could for many, many years, if not decades, to hide the truth and cover up the truth about Andrew's involvement with Epstein and Giuffre. And we know that Buckingham Palace signed off on what is reputed to be a $14 million settlement to Giuffre that was contingent upon her not speaking and saying nothing, that contained what's called a gagging order. So this is no fantasy by Epstein that Buckingham Palace would love it. And he then says, "You should ask someone to investigate the girl that has caused the Queen's son all this aggro. I promise you she is a fraud. You and I will be able to go to Ascot for the rest of our lives. I mean, it's so sickening. It's so sickening that this is what this man was thinking about as all these allegations were swirling around. He was just thinking about his own advantage, his own social situation. Could he be invited to Ascot with the Queen? I mean, it's so revolting. It's kind of hard to get your head around, really, how someone could be so cynical and just so gross. But there we are. But then we come to the probably what I would argue is the coup de grace for Andrew, from which I think there is no coming back. So Andrew has spent decades claiming that the photograph with Virginia Giuffre, well, decades might be an exaggeration, but he has spent over a decade arguing that the photo was fake. Now, I have been given loads and loads of excuses and reasons by his friends. His fingers are chubbier than they are in real life. The clothes that he's wearing don't match. The clothes that Virginia Giuffre is wearing, she was wearing in another photograph, and her image was taken from that photograph and put into this photograph. The photograph has been lost. You can't fit all the people into the photograph. If you were to restage the photograph, the Maxwell kids, of course, famously produced their extraordinary picture of two people in a bath at the house to say that she and Andrew could never have fitted in the bath, where she alleges that she had sex. I mean, they're all about as credible as Andrew's explanation that he doesn't sweat, in my honest opinion. You know, they're about as believable as Andrew's story that he was at Pizza Express in Woking and therefore couldn't have been at Tramp nightclub that evening. I mean, the whole thing is, I think, has long been regarded by anybody with half a brain as completely nonsense and a genuine photograph. And I know for a fact that Giuffre's legal team, when she was suing Andrew, were absolutely convinced that the photograph was genuine, and that actually, whether or not the photograph was genuine, what was actually even more important was that Andrew said he had never met her. So after he said that he'd never met her, if he'd said something like, you know, look, I'm Randy Andy, I've had sex with over 1,000 women in my whole life, I can't be expected to remember every single one. I had no idea that this person was there against their will. I'm afraid I don't remember it, but I'm sure it was, and I'm terribly sorry that this ever happened. That might have been, you know, as distasteful as it would be, that might have been a vaguely credible solution. Instead, Andrew stands accused of participating in a trafficking ring. That is what has happened. And let's not forget that participating in a trafficking ring is a sex crime. So these people who are still defending Andrew and still saying the picture is made up, even today, Thursday, November the 13th, are defending someone who looks very much like there is compelling evidence that they were involved in a sex crime. And I don't say that lightly, but that is the facts. And we now know that Epstein himself thought that the photograph was genuine, because in newly published exchanges, the financier, while he's urging a journalist to dig into Giuffre's background, concedes, yes, she was on my plane, and yes, she had her picture taken with Andrew, as many of my employees have. That's it, really, isn't it? For all the noise that Andrew and his defenders have generated about fakes and forgeries, Epstein, when it actually mattered, he treated the image as a banal fact, just one more sordid souvenir from his carousel of, you know, VIPs and young women. And I think it totally discredits this decade-long effort by Andrew and his side to try and undermine the veracity of that image, or say that that image is fake, or say that image is not real. I think every time that Andrew tried to deny that he was involved with Epstein or that he knew what was going on. There is this image staring back at us, Andrew leering back at us. And all these stories about Andrew's hands being chubbier than they were in the photograph, like his fingers became his fingers were the kind of biometric alibi that his friends brought forward. I think when Giuffre went on television, gave interviews insisting that the photographs were real, describing the night in question. Now, look, I know that there are problems with Giuffre's testimony. I know that she was a compromised witness. I know that she was not going to be called. She was not called to give evidence against Maxwell because prosecutors feared that she was a compromised witness. But I have spoken to people who knew and who met Giuffre and said that she was incredibly traumatized by what had happened to her. And I think we can see how traumatized she was by the fact that very sadly, earlier this year, she took her own life. So I do understand people. I think it's reasonable to say, from a purely empirical, logistical point of view, there are holes in Giuffre's story. There are many holes in Giuffre's story. Most famously, that she accused Alan Dershowitz of having a relation, of doing the same thing that was done to her, of abusing her, and subsequently had to retract that allegation because Dershowitz just denied it and was able to prove that he wasn't there on the days that she said that he was. And certainly, there are plenty of people who think that, where Epstein says the only person that she claims she didn't have sex with was Elvis, will kind of allow themselves to think that Epstein was very clever in the people that he picked, to the people that he targeted. They were vulnerable people, but the point is that for all this, for all of the holes in Giuffre's story, all of her lack of sophistication, the more that his supporters just fret about the shape of Andrew's knuckles, the lighting, it just began to look like they weren't trying to disprove the picture so much as just sort of freight it with doubt. And, then came the Newsnight interview in November 2019, sitting under the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace. Prince Andrew finally addressed the photo himself. And this is what he said. He said it could be him, but he insisted he had absolutely no memory of ever meeting Giuffre, and rolled out a new line where he said, from the investigations that we've done, I've always wondered who we is. Were the palace involved? From the investigations that we've done, you can't prove whether or not that photograph is faked or not, because it is a photograph of a photograph of a photograph. Now, that is true. I have spoken to the photographer who took the original photograph of the photograph, but this is actually before the era of digital news. This is a very standard news gathering technique, and it was called copying. So it was like, can you get a copy of the photos? And what you did was you just put the photos down and you took a photograph of them, and you photographed the front and the back, which luckily this New Zealand photographer who I have spoken to said that he did do. So the idea that because it's a photograph of a photograph somehow means that the incident did not happen, I think it never convinced people. And it clearly never convinced Jeffrey Epstein. I think people aren't stupid. The interview blew up his life. The rest is well known. What happened from that point on. His titles were stripped, and of course, it ended up finally 2 weeks ago with everything being taken away from him. And I think that Andrew's attempt to gaslight the entire world, to say this photograph was not real, to say this photograph was faked, it's actually a very classic MO of the palace, which is to make us not believe the evidence of our own eyes. This thing you're seeing, it didn't happen. You're imagining it. You're imagining it. You're imagining it. And Andrew tried to use this technique to make us think that we were imagining that this photograph was real and that it was not real. And it is extraordinary, isn't it, that in the end, it's down to Jeffrey Epstein to prove that the photograph is real. So I think, and so one more thing, to say, which is that there is another email from Epstein to Peter Mandelson, which says Epstein ruining the day that he met Andrew and saying that he should have taken Mandelson's advice not to hang out with Prince Andrew. Well, there we go. I think they were made for each other.